involved on the side of Europe, and who knows, never say never, casts its lot with Russia and China.
The world isn't shifting through revolutions or blazing headlines. It's changing through quiet recalibration. It begins in hushed diplomatic corridors, unfolds in strategic trade deals, and becomes concrete through military and economic alliances molded beyond the gaze of Western cameras. This is not just change, it's transformation. Multipolarity isn't some fashionable term among foreign policy circles. It's the reshaping of global influence. For more than half a century, the United States held the reins of global decision-making, not because the world voted it in, but because it seized leadership and dared any challenger to oppose it. Washington's perspectives became the filter for international norms, whether in war decisions, sanctions, or voting patterns within global institutions. But those times are shifting, slowly yet undeniably. We're now witnessing the emergence of a global structure no longer centered around a single superpower, but defined by multiple power nodes, each with their own networks, values, and priorities. At the heart of this developing multipolar world are two nations in particular, China and Russia. Together, they don't just reject Western dominance. They offer an alternative blueprint. China is cementing its leadership through a relentless wave of infrastructure projects, from sprawling railway lines in East Africa to smart cities across Southeast Asia. Russia, albeit bruised by sanctions and global scorn, is leveraging military strategy, energy diplomacy, and political constancy to entrench itself in zones the West has long taken for granted: Central Africa, the Sahel, and beyond. The strategy is not built on ideology but practicality. For African nations long subject to the consequences of Western interventions, military and economic, the rise of alternative power centers provides space to move. Where once the only roads to development passed through London, Paris, or Washington, now access to capital, expertise, and diplomacy flows from Beijing and Moscow too. Russian-backed security deals, Chinese-built infrastructure, and joint innovation hubs in agriculture and energy are now pillars of transformation across the continent. These shifts aren't sensational in the short term, but they are seismic in their effect. A subtle realization is taking root. The American-led world order is no longer the only game in town. Global power, once dictated by a few, is being contested, not with megaphones or missiles, but with contracts, construction cranes, and collaboration. What makes this even more significant is the Western response, not one of acceptance but resistance. Despite the public narratives of democracy, collaboration, and fair competition, there's an unmistakable undercurrent of fear. The idea that nations, particularly African nations, can now determine their own partners threatens a carefully maintained order. America's global leverage has always rested on more than aircraft carriers and embassies. The dollar's supremacy, control over SWIFT banking systems, gatekeeping roles within institutions like the IMF and World Bank, these were its unspoken strengths. Multipolarity eats away at that foundation, one bilateral deal at a time. Every time an African country finances infrastructure with yuan instead of dollars, the fortress cracks. Every security pact signed with Russian forces instead of NATO trainers is a blow to Western control. For too long, Africa was a chessboard for great powers. Today, Africa doesn't want to be a prize in anyone else's war. It wants to be a player on the board. This is where Africa steps into its agency. The narrative, long explored and long outdated, of Africa being helpless, reactive, and dependent, no longer holds water. Multipolarity enables a fresh dynamic, one based on partnership rather than patronage. The continent, once carved up by colonial powers, is learning how to deal on its own terms. It's leveraging the rise of China and the resurgence of Russia to create options, assert choice, and shake free from a half-century grip of debt diplomacy and structural adjustment. This does not mean Russia and China are altruists. Far from it. What they are disruptors. Their value lies not in promises of salvation, but in their ability to destabilize the monopoly of influence that the West enjoyed for decades. This disturbance matters, because now Africa can bargain from a position of leverage. It can turn east or west or neither, depending on what serves its people. That very possibility changes the entire structure of power. America isn't blind to this change. Washington has a long and well-documented history of using its tools, economic coercion, military pressure, intelligence operations, to protect its interests across the globe. Covert or overt, these measures have been designed to preserve a world built in its own image. But every year, every new trade deal bypassing a Western capital, every African summit held in Moscow or Beijing, serves as a signal. The monopoly is breaking. The malaises afflict not just the United States, but also former colonial powers like the United Kingdom and France. Aging populations, struggling economies, and fraying unions are symptoms of lost momentum. Internal contradictions within their own territories mirror the global shifts outside. And so power doesn't drop with a bang. It seeps away, leaks through diplomatic cracks, economic errors, and failing alliances. The West once tied its dominance to Africa through colonial histories, trade dependencies, and cultural propaganda. Now those ties are loosening. Look no further than the changing infrastructure map. Today's African highways, ports, energy networks, and digital corridors are being financed and built with Chinese currency and Russian expertise. Where NGOs and Western consultants once formed the elite circle around leaders, now strategic advisors from Beijing and Moscow are just as likely to be seen in presidential offices. Trade stats echo the same transformation. African exports once bound for Europe or North America are increasingly redirected to Asia, Latin America, and other parts of the global South. The terms of these exchanges matter too, not just goods but ideals. In international forums, the cracks in the Western Bloc's influence are visible in abstentions, dissenting votes, and new alignments. African nations are no longer marching in step with Euro-American consensus. They are speaking for themselves, sometimes quietly, sometimes loudly, but always deliberately. This erosion of loyalty is not the result of confrontation, it's the result of memory. Decades of imposed policies, broken development promises, and neo-colonial economic control have left deep reservoirs of mistrust. That mistrust is finally turning into action. Even the cultural arena is shifting. Where once only Western universities dictated the acceptable discourse, Africa's thinkers, authors, activists, and artists are building their own scenes. Chinese and Russian cultural diplomacy, language exchanges, history seminars, youth scholarships might appear minor, but they plant seeds. And seeds grow quietly. This quiet is something Lumumba has emphasized. The West moves publicly, with press conferences, international summits, and dramatic policy declarations. China and Russia? They move differently. No fanfare, no constant announcements, but steady implementation. When Beijing pledges a new railway, it does not launch a global PR campaign. It sends engineers. When Russia sends military trainers, it does not seek clicks, it teaches quietly. Africa watches and remembers that it's not about who shouts loudest, it's about who delivers. African governments, tired of being lectured, increasingly prefer the transactional clarity of Eastern partners over the moralistic ambiguity of Western aid. This doesn't sanctify Russia or China, it simply explains why their model resonates today. Western efforts to counter this shift are increasingly ineffective, not because the West lacks resources or reach, but because it lacks credibility. In its attempts to isolate Russia, it needs Africa. But the very history of manipulation and marginalization makes that hard to achieve. As strange as it may sound, Africa has emerged as a keystone, an irreplaceable piece in the global power puzzle. Its decisions now carry strategic weight. Whether through mineral exports critical to global industries or diplomatic alignment that influences international legitimacy, Africa holds cards it never had before. Raw materials like cobalt, uranium, and rare earths are no longer just exports, they're leverage. Military access to ports and airfields is no longer granted by default, it's a negotiation. Cultural approval, once monopolized by European languages and media, is a contested space. Today, China's Belt and Road projects, the continent like arteries, pumping life into transport and logistics systems that redefine Africa's global role. Russian naval access points in coastal states reposition the geopolitical chessboard. And above all, Africa offers something the West has struggled to reclaim: legitimacy. When African leaders close deals with Russia and China, they rewrite the narrative Western media long controlled. Russia is no longer a rogue when met with ceremonial handshakes in Addis Ababa. China is not a threat when hundreds of students board flights to universities in Shanghai. For the West, this is a formidable challenge. To isolate Russia now, it must convince Africa to leave its side. But force won't work. Pressure could backfire. And inaction allows the Eastern embrace to deepen, so the question is no longer, is the global order changing? It's, can the West evolve before its dominance becomes a relic? Because what we're witnessing is an Africa not reactive but strategic. An Africa that isn't content being the ground others fight over. It's becoming the kingmaker. And in a world defined by balance, not domination, kingmakers set the rules. The silence of multipolarity is deceiving. It may not make headlines, but it's rewriting history.